I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and here are your data points. Today, we are discussing U.S. privacy policy in the new administration. We're recording this in early December 2024, about a month after Donald Trump won the general election for president of the United States. With this election, senior leadership of all U.S. federal agencies will change, and perhaps even more deeply than that, going to beyond senior leadership to other team members within each one of those agencies. And meanwhile, Congress will also be controlled by Republicans. And with the change in administrations and the government no longer being divided, I think we can all agree that change is afoot. So what does this mean for U.S. privacy policy? That's the question that many of our clients are asking, and the question for which I've invited three of my colleagues to the podcast. Mark Brennan leads our privacy policy practice. Bret Cohen leads our FTC practice. And joining Mark and Bret is Harsimar Dhanoa. He's a frequent guest of the podcast and focuses his practice on policy, compliance, and investigations. Bret, Harsimar, Mark, welcome to the podcast. Mark, maybe I can ask you to get us started. For those who have not seen changes of U.S. administrations and the elections of a new president, what does that mean in practice, especially as we start seeing different names be appointed for key posts inside of the new administration?
Scott, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here today with our listeners. I think the change of administration really underscores just how many individuals are involved in policymaking. There are a number of agencies. You've also got policymaking occurring in the legislature. And as we'll discuss, at both the federal and state level in the US, you'll continue to see these new developments. So focusing first on the federal administration change, the incoming president has already announced a number of intended appointments. A number of those will need to be confirmed by the Senate. And we'll see ultimately many federal agencies will have their leadership change, so that if it's a commission, it could be the chair of the commission. Often those are selected by the president, normally to be on those commissions, whether we're talking about the Federal Trade Commission, Federal Communications Commission. Normally you have to go through Senate confirmation, but there are instances where there's a sitting commissioner, the president can designate them often as chair without needing additional Senate involvement. And an example of where we've seen that is over at the Federal Communications Commission. Existing Commissioner Brendan Carr, the president has announced that he intends to select him as chair for the commission once he takes office. So we'll see as these appointments move through their respective processes. And then where you have change in administration at the agencies, often there will be new vacancies on those commissions. So new appointments will need to be made, vetted, and move through those agencies. And on the legislative side, in the Senate, the change in control from the Democrats to the Republicans will mean that the relevant committee chairs, the ranking members, will be from different parties going forward. And ultimately, when you put all these pieces together at the federal level, it is the chairs of the committees, chairs in the chambers and the agencies, et cetera, that will ultimately control the agendas. And so when you think about the policy setting, the policy making, the Republican Party will control the agenda for these agencies and their related rulemakings and other inquiries. And on the legislative side, just as we see in prior administrations, the leads for the respective chambers will determine the policy priorities there.
Yeah, and Mark, maybe a follow-up on that is that, many of our members of our audience are not in the United States and they don't see how this is working from a day-to-day practice. But I think one thing that probably everybody in the US knows is that the government is really big, and trying to lead any function within the United States is a really difficult job just to get everybody marching in the same direction. And that could be the political appointees who are, as you're mentioning, are now taking over new roles, some of which they are deeply expert on. Sometimes they're kind of learning it for the first time, but they're also now in charge of setting out policy which would be implemented by members of staff who are not going to have change role. They may have been in these roles for some period of time. Interested in your perspective about how quickly a new leader can work inside of that environment.
It's such a great point, Scott. And, I think those who have been in these leadership positions, whether chair of a commission or head of an agency, will tell you that it is a lot easier to be either on the outside or one of the other commissioners criticizing the chair than to actually be the chair and expected to get the work done. The truth is it will vary. There will be some where the agency heads can begin work essentially on day one, and that would seem to be the path available over at the FCC. Where there are new appointments that need to be made, that process can take time. And I think the Biden administration actually had some of the longest timing for some of its appointees. There were several that went into the second and I think even the third year of the term. My sense is that many of these appointments, especially with one party controlling the legislature and as president, you'll see a lot of these move faster. And either it'll be pretty clear early on that nominee is going to move forward, or as we've already seen in at least one instance with the incoming administration, that the signals may be there that the nominee is not going to move forward and you'll need to move to another nominee. But the faster that process goes, whether it's up or down, the more quickly the individuals can be operating at the agencies. And then once they are situated, there will need to be essentially another round of leadership team appointments, designations, and so forth, some of which are political appointees, and others, frankly, are just getting the staff refocused on the new priorities. And so this will vary from agency to agency, but I expect you'll see significant shifts based on what we heard during the campaign and after Election Day. So I think there will be a lot of movement and fast at the federal level.
Yeah, interesting. But in some ways, it's almost like the U.S. government is not this kayak that can kind of maneuver in and out of things very quickly. It's more of the giant freighter that, slowly you can change course, but it's going to take a while for that to swing in the direction that the captain had set out.
That has historically been true. I think an open question is whether the new administration is really focused on trying to change the speed of the rate of change at which the federal government moves.
Yeah, really interesting. Maybe an example of the dynamic, Mark, that you're describing can really help here. And maybe, Bret, I want to ask you to jump in on how you're seeing this play out, in particular with the FTC. The FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission, is been the primary federal regulator on privacy issues broadly. It is not the only U.S. federal regulator that has stepped in with respect to privacy. We have many, but it is probably the primary one that has the largest maybe impact on privacy-oriented issues. How do you expect that the change in administration will impact the FTC, both in practice and its priorities?
So it's a really interesting question that a lot of people are trying to prognosticate, Scott. So the first thing to keep in mind is the FTC is primarily not a political agency. It's primarily a law enforcement agency. And so a lot of it is going to be, as you alluded to before, business as usual, driven by staff. So, that said, the president appoints a majority of the commissioners and the chairs. The types of cases that the commission brings, its rulemakings, how it uses its bully pulpit to describe what business practices it wants to encourage, can all be, this type of policy and enforcement focus can be driven by the interests of the commissioners. And certainly they have the right to vote out what cases the commission ultimately brings. So it will certainly have an impact at the agency. There's a couple aspects of how it will impact the agency in terms of the nuts and bolts of who will actually run the agency. Right now, we have a full commission led by 3 Democratic commissioners and 2 Republican commissioners. Commissioners do not automatically lose their roles when a new administration comes into place. So, in theory, the Democrats can retain their majority until their replacements are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Replacing FTC commissioners has not typically been the first priority of incoming administrations, but in the past few changes of party and administrations, the chairs have resigned after a couple months. And that will create some level of uncertainty if there's not a 3-2 situation, depending on who stays on and who resigns and who's replaced until the 3 Republican commissioners are appointed. So then, what does that happen? What does that mean for the enforcement priorities? So, conventional wisdom is that a Republican FTC will be less interested in focusing on pressing novel theories of consumer harm than a Democratic FTC might do. And let's say that this FTC has a reputation for pushing the envelope a bit, and they might take that as a badge of honor. And in some cases, it really forces companies to think through, what is the next step that we have to do to stay ahead of what the FTC wants us to do. But with a change in administration, it may be that we then focus on more clear-cut and well-established theories of consumer harm from privacy violations. I think certainly data security is not going anywhere, right? Companies that have data security breaches by through not maintaining commercially standard practices are still going to be a focus, especially when there's consumer harm resulting. And I think also there's a number of issues that come across the aisle that there might not be that much of a shift in focus on. So, for example, children's issues, very much at the forefront and top of mind of the FTC, of Congress, puts a lot of pressure on the FTC to look into certain areas. How children use social media, for example, harms that may result from the use of AI. And I think, another sort of across the aisle issue is of techlash. We see it in Congress, and I think we can see it in terms of views coming out of the FTC and how tech companies should comport themselves and what information they should collect and how they should use it on the privacy side. So I think a lot of these issues really won't change so much, and we'll continue to see enforcement in those areas. Where we may see differences, again, are on completely novel theories, and I think also some of the broader policy objectives of the FTC. So, for example, a couple years ago, in the summer of 2022, the FTC made headlines by announcing their commercial surveillance and data security rulemaking. And this was sort of a watershed moment because the FTC hadn't used this particular tool for rulemaking under Section 5 for quite some time. It's a cumbersome process. And the thinking now is that they may not proceed with that particular rulemaking under the new administration. That may not be the priority. So those are the sort of things that I expect to see. I think what's interesting, and if folks want to get ahead of the curve, is they should start to look at some of the enforcement actions that have come out from the FTC in the past 6 months to a year and take a look at the dissents and the concurrences of the Republican commissioners, Commissioner Holyoke and Commissioner Ferguson, who are two of the more newly appointed commissioners. They've sort of tried to make their mark and explain their policy objectives through those dissents and concurrences in some public speaking. And the tone that some of those have struck are that they don't want the FTC's overall enforcement of Section 5 to curtail innovation or to hold up some of the technological progress that's going forward, while still, of course, being aware of harms to consumers and wanting companies to act responsibly. And so I think they're expected to stay on with a new administration and to be part of the majority. So those are some areas that folks can take a look at. There's one other literal X factor to look at, and that is the influence of Elon Musk on the new administration. Maybe he'll listen to our podcast, maybe he won't. But, certainly Twitter or X and Mr. Musk have locked horns with the FTC quite a bit over the past few years. He may have some distinct thoughts on their policy objectives and aims, and that could color at least how a presidential nominee might be and whether or not they have similar types of thinking about how our privacy and Section 5, the FTC Act, should be enforced.
I mean, really interesting, Bret. Certainly, I appreciate your doing the plug for the open invitation that I have to Elon Musk to join the podcast whenever it is that his schedule allows. But interested in your perspective on enforcement here, right? Because I think one of the things that probably most people would say about this current FTC is that they are certainly leaning in with respect to active enforcement, active, areas where they are doing investigations on a number of different topics. From your perspective, any change in that with a new set of majority leaders, at least at the commissioner level?
Investigations are primarily staff led, and staff's not going to change. Certainly some people might decide to leave the agency, and that could change just some things, but I'm sure existing investigations are going to go on. Where the differences will be among the margins is whether or not some cases are so novel or speculative that once a Republican majority comes into place, they might decide that they don't agree with staff and don't want to move forward with some of the staff's recommendations. But at the same time, they all have their own interest in collaborating and working together with staff and hearing them out and bringing some cases that staff has been building and feels strongly about. So it's not as if everything just gets cut out and thrown out the door. I think there's going to be a fair amount of continuation in sort of existing investigations and enforcement. But then, each new majority comes in and has priorities of which laws they want to try and enforce and in which ways. For example, a few years ago, we saw a spate of enforcement under the Restoring Online Shoppers Confidence Act for recurring subscriptions, and that's something where consumers frequently complain, and it's a cross-party issue, and those are just we don't know what the new priorities of the new chair will be, and so it'll be interesting to figure out who that will be, and then to from that we'll be able to try and ascertain where their enforcement priorities might lie.
Yeah, super helpful, Bret. Maybe next question is for Harsimar and Mark. I think as everybody who's followed this election, I think it's safe to assume that privacy wasn't a leading issue that was being hotly debated amongst the candidates. I think the focus was on immigration and abortion and taxes and tariffs and the many other things that filled the headlines on a daily basis. That said, we have had, interests. So we have a variety of people who have interests on kind of trying to do that balance that Bret was talking about between regulation and consumer protection and privacy versus innovation, and trying to set ourselves up for being the innovators with respect to AI and machine learning and all of the many other things that are on the horizon. Interested in your perspectives about, do we see any clues about where there could be priorities for the new administration, more generally coming from the top, around how to think about either the balance between innovation and regulation, or more importantly, thinking about data protection in particular, and whether we see indications that there could be things like federal legislation on the horizon? Harsimar, maybe I'll open it up for you first.
Yeah, a couple of reactions. I think on the sort of decision that you mentioned between regulation and consumer protection on one side and innovation on the other, that is a key balance that I think in the case of this administration, the weight is really on the side of innovation. And in particular, not just innovation for innovation's sake, but innovation as part of the larger national security conversation, and how the United States can remain competitive with other global powers, namely China. And so that, I think, is going to shift and largely drive a good part of the conversation, particularly on the AI front. On the federal privacy legislation piece, I think that's the question I've been asked most often. Do we think that now is the time? I think my short answer is people have been asking for federal privacy legislation for the past, I want to say, 50 years. So I wouldn't hold your breath per se. But in some ways, having a government trifecta with control both over the executive and both houses or both branches of Congress, is a good sign. But that doesn't mean that it's a shoo-in overall. There have been other instances. I think in early 2021 there was a Democratic trifecta. And there's still a lot of legislative priorities. And to your point earlier, the federal government is made up of a lot of different policymakers and key opinion formers. And so you need to really do the work to get them all aligned in the same direction. And that can be very difficult to do. And so as you're sort of hashing out the various policy battles that are priorities, whether privacy will be one that comes to the top and says, we actually want to have a federal privacy framework in place. It remains to be seen whether or not that will, rise and make its way to say, yeah, this is what we want to do.
Harsimar, I agree. And I think you picked up on a really good point that we will continue to see getting a lot of attention in the next few years, which is that just because one party may control the legislature and the presidency, it doesn't mean that these things are done deals. They're, especially in the House, where the Republicans have a very slim majority, every vote will count. We've seen how that can play out looking at the Democrats in the Senate over the last few years. Three examples that come to mind where you could see some of the privacy, data protection, cyber issues really bubbling up at the federal level. Trade. So, the prior several administrations have been focused on the connections between trade policy, data flows, cross-border data, and the like. And there will continue to be this emphasis on China and other threats, and as stated by the administrations, the threats to American consumers, threats to American businesses. So expect that you'll continue to see that bulk data transfer proceeding could evolve, but ultimately the underlying themes may continue to be present. Cross-border data flows. I had seen reports recently where the new administration may be signaling to the EU that if there are any ripples with the adequacy decision, that that U.S. law enforcement may no longer share information with European law enforcement. And you could see additional evolutions in the discussions between the regions on that. And then finally, AI. We'll continue to see a lot of emphasis on AI. What I think may evolve is the Biden administration, from a certain perspective, was highly unfriendly to the companies and stakeholders that are looking to promote the development and deployment of AI technology in the US and to ensure US leadership in AI. A lot of the administration's focus seemed to be almost a defensive, protective approach to AI. And we saw other countries putting more of an emphasis on innovation and supporting these new technologies. I think you will see a shift in that direction going forward, more towards a pro-innovation strategy around AI, perhaps drones, other new technologies. And we'll have to see as things get into the details. But there was a sense by significant segments among stakeholders that the current administration had been highly unfriendly to new technologies.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think we would also point out is that the new administration hasn't always been the fan of big tech, right? In other words, there has been a number of very prominent areas of dispute and concern that the new presidents and members of the administration have raised about big tech, which could also be playing out. But maybe in the last few minutes here, I'm also interested in another dynamic, because I think everybody who follows this show or has kind of active in the space knows that the U.S. federal government has not been the leader with setting out U.S. privacy policy, has not been the leader about setting out what the global privacy framework would be, right? That's largely been left to the EU, and in the United States, it's largely been led by the states. To what extent does the new change in federal administrations impact the way that the states carry on their business and continue to lean in or maybe lean out of these important privacy areas?
Scott, I'm happy to start that one. And Harsimar, I know you'll have some views on this as well. I'd expect the states to be as or more active on digital issues, so privacy, cyber, AI, online safety, and other areas, as they have been in the last few years. You raise a good point. I mean, it's been, if anything, leadership by inaction at the federal level for decades now. But where I think you'll see a lot of focus next year, the Democratic-led states are already expressing a sense that it's up to them to show leadership on priorities that are not being picked up by Republicans. And so It remains to be seen exactly what the focus areas will be. I think you could see, for example, a doubling down of what we've seen in the states on AI already with some of that prescriptive regulation. There was some dissatisfaction in the US at the level of granularity and a feeling of heavy-handedness coming from the EU AI Act. And so I don't think you see a copy and paste into the US at the state level, but we did see efforts. California had a number of bills around AI, some of which got signed, one of which was vetoed by the governor, and Colorado enacted an AI law. So that'll be one we'll continue to see activity there. But again, it's that tension between where the policy priorities may be. Is it on some of the bias, discrimination, fairness issues that we saw under the prior administration of the federal government, or is it going to be more focused on traditional approaches to supporting new technologies? We'll have to see. The privacy evolutions, Harsimar, I know you'll have thoughts on this, but I think we're seeing now this continued race to regulate by the states. We're approaching 20, depending on how you count, states that have the comprehensive privacy laws. And we're seeing now that some of the states that had passed laws early on are now amending their laws to, in their view, keep pace with the more recently enacted laws. And every time a new state passes a law, it's essentially adding something new. I think that trend will continue. And online safety continues to be, just to wrap that up, continues to be an area of focus. There are significant constitutional issues that are working their way through courts along with Section 230 issues. I think we'll see a lot of court evolution there that may impact some of the legislative drafting. But there continues to be no penalty for legislatures that pass unconstitutional legislation. So I think they have every incentive to keep trying and looking for those headlines to say that they're taking steps to protect children online. And you know, the hope is that there will be more broad stakeholder involvement and input going forward on how best to address some of these challenges. Harsimar, over to you.
Yeah, I think Mark covered it pretty well. And to summarize it, I think the state legislatures are just going to turn it up to 11. And if you'd been sort of tracking along on the privacy side and the state patchwork and sort of counting the individual states, you're going to essentially need to add layers to that map of where is the AI legislation, where is the online safety legislation? Because even though they seem like separate topics, the interconnections between them are really, really embedded in them. And so it's not like you can say, listen, I don't need to think about online safety at all. You really have to look at how all of those various layers are coming together. The other interesting thing I'll note is that we're also starting to see federal agencies start to recognize limitations on their ability, or that leadership by inaction that Mark mentioned, and start to say to state legislatures, hey, there are things that you should be doing as well because you're more flexible, more nimble, and actually get some of these laws passed. And so that's another thing to keep an eye out of. It's not just the state legislatures acting in isolation. Both, some government entities as well as a lot of civil advocacy organizations are trying to help steer state legislatures in a certain direction by saying, these are the priority issues, here's sample legislation that you should be using, or states that you shouldn't be following, and trying to steer the conversation that way.
Yeah, really good points from both of you. And maybe I would add, it's not only the legislators that I think are the ones to be watching at the state level. It's also, areas where we're seeing law enforcement or the regulators, especially state AG, now to kind of fill in perhaps gaps that they see at the federal level, or perhaps find a new voice in the way that they would want to interpret things like their own mini FTC acts about what would constitute unfair, deceptive trade practices. You're already seeing that with Texas and the state of Arkansas and kind of a number of other AGs that are now leaning into enforcing their consumer protection laws with respect to privacy or AI in new and innovative ways. And my guess is that will continue, which is the point that was made in a podcast that you haven't listened to it yet. Last week's podcast with my colleague Jason Downs from our state AG practice, indicated, listen, every one of the 50 or so AG out there are, in the position of interpreting how they think about what constitute unfair deception in in connection with technological innovations and privacy and AI. And that area of discretion and flexibility will likely see continued evolution at the state side.
Yeah, I was gonna make a very similar point. I agree with you. Not only will AGs who feel like their enforcement priorities don't align with the FTC's may decide to take up some of those theories under their own unfair and deceptive practices authority. I mean, a lot of the new state laws that we just saw passed in the last couple years, which are starting to now state AG offices are starting to learn what those laws mean, and to ramp up their own internal enforcement staff and educational uh, uh, initiatives related to getting companies to comply. I mean, we'll be right in that sweet spot of a couple years out, and they're starting to investigate some of those new state privacy laws that have been passed the past few years. So I would say, definitely to see more activity at the state level for both of those reasons.
Yeah, really good point. So I know we're running close on time, but I'll just ask maybe in rapid fire form one last question. I think, many of the folks that we work with, our clients and our contacts at our clients, are used to changes in legislation, changes in regulation, changes in enforcement. It's been frankly the headline for the past 10 plus years that there's constantly something new in this space. And so they may well, anticipate that there's going to be more of that. That said, there you can expect that there's going to be change, but you can receive change both prepared and unprepared. And the consequences of whether you're prepared or unprepared will mean how effective you are in responding to that change. Interested in each of your perspectives about maybe the one thing that you may think about doing over the course of the next couple of months to prepare your organization for what is intended to be change at the federal level. Mark, maybe I'll ask you to start.
Scott, thank you. The word prepare is critical. One thing that we sometimes see, there's so much activity here, right? You've got so many proposed bills in motion, and not just in the US, but globally. You also have proposed regulations, a number of pending proceedings, federal, state, also in other jurisdictions if you're managing globally. And I think there can be a tendency by some to say, you know what, there's just too much to keep up with. Just let me know when something passes, or let me know when something has been enacted and when I have to do it. And the truth is that has a habit of catching a lot of the product teams, and you can think of the product councils, but also the business teams, engineering, the development teams. Often the product lead times can be significant in the tech space. And so what I think can be really helpful here is having regular conversations. So if you're somebody with responsibility on seeing some of these bills and looking at the potential impacts, have regular conversations, set periodic check-ins with the product councils, with other teams to prepare them, give them an update on what's happening. Make sure they're keyed into the trend lines, the market movements year over year, benchmarking and what you're seeing in different jurisdictions. One frequent trend that we see in the US is that invasion, if you will, of regulations that have appeared somewhere else in the world that are now, being adopted in different parts of the US. And so thinking about that and getting ahead of that from a product perspective can be really, really valuable.
Yeah, really, I think important insights. Bret, maybe I'd ask you, maybe with a specific focus, you represent, a number of organizations who are either subject to FTC orders or, are engaged with the FTC through investigations or CIDs and through a number of other ways. Interested in your thoughts, what to do for maybe that group of organizations during the next few months as this new change is coming into effect.
Sure. I'll suggest two things. The first one is something I mentioned earlier, which is take a look at those dissents, concurrences, and speeches by the existing Republican FTC commissioners to get a sense of where their policy priorities lie. I think there's some notion of push back on some of the priorities of the existing commission leadership, but there are some other nuggets in there that also will be helpful to look for. So that's the first. The second, I would say, is what we alluded to in the last discussion about the state level, which is if we are going to start to see more enforcement at the state level, if you haven't yet prepared for the 12 or 13 new states laws that came into force in the past year or so, or that were enacted and that will come into force within the next year or so, maybe start to focus on, as Mark really helpfully pointed out, where to get those on the product roadmap to make sure that ultimately, when those do take effect, that you're in a good compliance posture at a state level if we start to see more enforcement there.
Yeah, really good point. Maybe Harsimar, why don't you round us out?
Yeah, I think really the important part is to talk with the business and get a sense of what the priority areas are. One, I think particularly Mark was mentioning, there's a long lead time that comes with making improvements on the tech stack itself with the product teams, but there are also ancillary pieces of the business that may be impacted, that may have a significant lift involved. The one that comes to mind is marketing teams in particular, making sure that they're prepared, because oftentimes it's easy for them to think things are marching as usual and there's not as much changes, but making sure that you're having regular touch points with them to understand what have we done previously, are there any changes that are on the horizon, what are the likelihood what's the likelihood of those changes, and then from there they're also on board.
Really important insights. Maybe I'd add one of my own, and that is be informed. And I would say, I've learned this, Mark and Harsimar, directly from you. I've learned that, listen, there's a lot of things that are happening on the policy side, and you need to have the contacts and the people to know what conversation is being happened in the public, and maybe what conversation is being happened outside of the cameras and outside of the journalists. Both of those are important conversations to know is being had. Both of those conversations will impact you. And so to the extent that you want to be in the business position to be prepared to understand what the impact is, you need to know what's happening. And importantly, if you want to have a role in helping shape out or mature a new policy initiative, have that team ready to go. And know what is it that matters and perhaps maybe what doesn't matter in connection with any new policy initiative. So important, especially in times where we are moving is not so clear. With that, I'll really want to express my gratitude to Bret, Mark, and Harsimar for joining the podcast. You guys were terrific. I always learn so much whenever we have an opportunity to discuss these things. But thank you again for joining and sharing your insights with the larger audience.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having us, Scott.
With that, I'm Scott Loughlin. This is the Data Chronicles, and those were your data points.